Hi everyone, welcome to our channel, where we share meaningful and inspiring stories every day. Today, I want to take you on a journey, a story about kindness, transformation, and how small acts can create a big impact in someone's life. If you love heartfelt stories, life-changing lessons, and want to spread positivity to the world, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep bringing more amazing stories to life. Now let's dive into the incredible story of a young, miserable boy that will make you won't want to skip. What would you do if the person you love most needed you more than ever, and all you had was sheer determination and a heart filled with fear? How would you decide when life forces you to stand on the fine line between right and wrong, between your own safety and the survival of someone you hold dear? This was the question Nathan, a 10-year-old boy, faced on a cold winter night. That fateful night not only changed Nathan's life forever, but also left a profound lesson for his entire community, and perhaps for all of us. The small town where Nathan lived was tucked away behind desolate hills, far removed from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. In the grip of winter, the town became even more isolated and desolate. The biting wind howled down empty streets, its eerie whistle echoing off the frozen ground below. A thick blanket of snow covered every surface, its pristine white marred only by the occasional footprint that crunched through the icy crust. The houses stood close together, but the dimly lit windows and tightly drawn curtains seemed to emphasize the sense of solitude. Each family lived as though in its own bubble, disconnected from their neighbors, avoiding any gaze that might acknowledge the struggles of others. The chill of winter wasn't just in the air, it lingered in the hearts of the townspeople, who had grown accustomed to turning away from hardship. At the very edge of this quiet, indifferent town stood Nathan's home. It was a small, run-down house that seemed almost forgotten. The peeling paint and sagging roof tiles spoke of years of neglect. Moss and ivy crept up the sides, as though trying to reclaim the structure for nature. Every gust of wind made the front door creak and groan, as though it too was struggling to hold itself together. Inside Nathan's home, the cold was just as biting. The thin walls barely kept out the wind, which slipped through every crack and gap with an unrelenting chill. The kitchen was dim and unwelcoming, the weak light of a single bulb casting long shadows over the old wooden table that sat at the center. The table's surface was worn and scarred, its legs uneven, and beside it sat a chair missing one of its arms. In the corner stood a battered refrigerator that hummed faintly. Nathan knew its contents all too well, nothing but a few slices of stale bread from the week before. He would often open it out of habit, hoping against hope that there might be something new, but each time he was met with disappointment. Quietly, he would close the door, as though afraid to let the cold light inside reveal the emptiness that mirrored their lives. On the bed, Lily, Nathan's 4-year-old sister, lay curled under a thin blanket. Her face was flushed red, her small body trembling with fever. Her breath came in shallow, labored gasps, and her lips were cracked and dry. Nathan watched her, his heart heavy with fear. He had tried everything he could think of, placing a damp cloth on her forehead, tucking her in tightly, but nothing seemed to work. Nathan sat beside Lily, his small hands clutching hers as if willing his warmth to reach her. His wide, tear-filled eyes never left her face, scanning for any sign of improvement. His young mind raced with thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. What should I do? How can I save her? He wondered, his heart pounding with each unanswered question. His gaze drifted to the staircase that led to the attic. Their mother, Mary, had locked herself away there, lost in a haze of alcohol and despair. Once a vibrant and loving parent, Mary had crumbled under the weight of her own struggles after losing her job. For months now, Nathan had been the one holding their little family together. Yet Nathan didn't feel anger toward his mother. He understood that she was broken in a way he couldn't fix. Instead, he felt a heavy sense of responsibility, as if the burden of their survival rested entirely on his tiny shoulders. As he looked at Lily, so small and fragile, A wave of protectiveness washed over him. She was his reason for trying, his reason for enduring. Even in the darkest moments, her smile had been enough to give him hope. But now, that hope was slipping away, and he was terrified of what might happen if he couldn't act fast enough. In the stillness of the night, Nathan's thoughts drifted to a time when their house was filled with warmth and laughter. He remembered the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen, the sound of their mother humming as she cooked. Those were the days when they would all sit together at the table, sharing stories and dreams. One memory stood out above the rest: Lily's second birthday. Mary had baked an apple pie, and Nathan had crafted a paper crown for his sister, carefully folding and decorating it with whatever scraps he could find. Lily's laughter had echoed through the house as she wore her makeshift crown proudly, her tiny hands clutching a slice of pie. In that moment, Nathan had felt like the best brother in the world. But those days were gone, replaced by silence and struggle. Nathan clung to those memories like a lifeline, a reminder of what they had once been, and what he desperately wanted to protect. Outside the window, the night seemed to stretch on forever. The streetlights cast a faint, flickering glow, their golden light barely cutting through the darkness. Shadows stretched and shifted across the snow, their eerie forms dancing in the icy wind. The bare branches of trees swayed and creaked, adding an unsettling soundtrack to the stillness. Nathan turned his gaze back to Lily. Her breathing was shallow, and her small body shook under the threadbare blanket. The sight of her like this was more than he could bear. If I don't do something, I'll lose her, he thought, his chest tightening with dread. He rose to his feet, determination replacing his fear. Grabbing his old, tattered coat, he pulled it tightly around himself. The fabric was thin and worn, offering little protection against the bitter cold, but it was all he had. Before stepping outside, he glanced at Lily one last time. "I'll be back soon," he whispered, his voice steady despite the tears welling up in his eyes. As he opened the door, the icy wind hit him like a wall, stealing his breath for a moment. But he pressed on, stepping into the cold, unrelenting night. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he would do whatever it took to save his sister. Nathan's house sat at the very end of the street, almost as though it were trying to hide from the rest of the town. Surrounded by the barren expanse of snow-covered fields, it seemed out of place, a forgotten relic of better days. The house was small, its faded yellow paint barely visible beneath years of grime and moss. The wooden porch creaked under the weight of even the smallest footsteps, and the front door sagged slightly on its hinges, as if exhausted from decades of use. Beyond the house, the landscape stretched into a blur of white and gray. The sky was heavy with low-hanging clouds that seemed ready to burst with more snow at any moment. The trees stood bare and skeletal, their branches etched against the dull sky like the veins of some forgotten giant. The occasional gust of wind sent a flurry of snowflakes swirling through the air, their movement chaotic and restless. The only sign of life was the thin ribbon of smoke rising from Nathan's chimney. It curled upward in the icy air, a fragile testament to the warmth that Nathan fought so hard to maintain inside the crumbling walls. Stepping inside offered little respite from the cold. The house was a patchwork of failed repairs and makeshift solutions. A blanket hung over one window to block the draft, while another was sealed shut with strips of duct tape. The air carried a damp chill that clung to the skin, and every breath seemed to hang momentarily in the frigid air before dissipating. The kitchen, though small, was the heart of the house. A battered wood-burning stove occupied one corner, its faint glow providing the only source of heat. The stove crackled weakly, the flames licking at the last few pieces of firewood Nathan had managed to gather. Above it, an old kettle sat, its once shiny surface dulled with age. The faint whistle of steam rising from its spout was the only sound, apart from the ever-present wind rattling the windows. Nathan moved about the kitchen with practiced efficiency, his small hands steady despite the biting cold. He placed a chipped plate on the table and carefully arranged the food he had managed to scavenge that morning. A bruised apple, a handful of wilted lettuce leaves, and a slice of bread so stale it crumbled at the edges. He glanced toward the bedroom where Lily slept. It's not much, he thought, biting his lip, but it'll have to do. Mornings were always the hardest. Nathan's day began before the sun had a chance to rise, when the town was still wrapped in the quiet stillness of early winter. He would slip on his coat, its fabric worn thin in too many places, and step outside into the biting cold. The streets were deserted at that hour, the only sound being the crunch of his footsteps against the frozen ground. He moved quickly and quietly, weaving through alleyways and pausing behind restaurants and shops where he knew the dumpsters were kept. Nathan had become an expert at this silent scavenging, his small fingers working swiftly to sift through the refuse in search of anything that could be salvaged. Some mornings yielded better results than others. A half-eaten sandwich, a bag of slightly bruised vegetables, or, on lucky days, a container of leftover soup. But more often than not, the pickings were slim, forcing Nathan to make do with scraps that others wouldn't have glanced at twice. Today's haul was meager, but Nathan treated it with the care it deserved. Every little bit counts, he reminded himself as he made his way home, clutching the cloth bag tightly against his chest to keep its contents warm. By the time Nathan returned, the first rays of light were beginning to filter through the frost-covered windows, casting pale shadows across the kitchen floor. He set the bag down on the counter and began to prepare breakfast. The bruised apple was carefully sliced, the damaged parts discarded. The stale bread was toasted lightly over the stove, its edges turning golden brown. The wilted lettuce was rinsed under cold water, its leaves revived just enough to appear fresh. "Lily, breakfast is ready," Nathan called softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. There was a rustle of movement from the next room, followed by the appearance of Lily, her small frame bundled in an oversized sweater. Her hair was unkempt, and her cheeks were pale, save for the faint flush brought on by the cold. Yet despite her tired appearance, she greeted Nathan with a smile that made his efforts feel worthwhile. "Is it apple day?" she asked, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the slices on her plate. Nathan nodded, forcing a smile. "Yep, it's apple day," he said, his voice cheerful despite the heaviness in his heart. Lily ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. Nathan watched her from across the table, his own stomach growling quietly. He had long since grown accustomed to going without, choosing instead to give Lily whatever little food they had. "How's your tummy today?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "It's okay," Lily replied, though her hand instinctively moved to her stomach. Nathan's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Good," he said. "We'll have an even bigger breakfast tomorrow." As Nathan cleaned up after breakfast, his thoughts wandered to a time when life had been different. He could still remember the warmth of their home when their mother, Mary, was working as a chef at the local restaurant. The kitchen had been her domain, filled with the rich aroma of stews and pies that made their mouths water long before dinner was served. Nathan remembered sitting at the table with Lily, watching their mother move with practiced grace as she prepared their meals. Her laughter had filled the house, her energy contagious. But those memories felt distant now, like a dream from another life. Since losing her job, Mary had retreated into herself, seeking solace in bottles of cheap alcohol. The vibrant woman Nathan had known was gone, replaced by someone who barely spoke, barely moved. Nathan didn't blame her. He couldn't. He knew she was hurting in ways he couldn't understand, but it didn't make his own burden any lighter. As the day wore on, the temperature continued to drop. Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing the town in a layer of white that muffled every sound. Nathan sat by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared out at the stillness beyond. His thoughts were heavy, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. How long can we keep this up? How much more can she take? He turned his gaze toward Lily, who had fallen asleep on the couch, her small body curled into a tight ball beneath a thin blanket. Her chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, and for a moment Nathan felt a flicker of peace. But that peace was fleeting. He knew the fight wasn't over. And as he sat there staring into the bleak winter landscape, a quiet resolve began to take shape within him. No matter what it takes, he thought, his jaw tightening with determination, I'll take care of her. Nathan's gaze drifted to the door leading to the attic, where their mother had retreated hours ago. He could hear faint sounds of movement from above, the occasional creak of floorboards as she shifted in her sleep, or perhaps in another drunken haze. He had tried to wake her earlier, banging on the door and shouting for her to help, but she hadn't responded, her silence more deafening than the wind howling outside. Nathan had given up after a few minutes, knowing it was useless. It's up to me, he thought, his jaw tightening with determination. It always was. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could wait until morning and hope that Lily's fever broke on its own. But the thought of doing nothing while she lay there, struggling to breathe, was unbearable. Then, an idea began to take shape. He remembered the pharmacy at the edge of town, a small building that had once been a lifeline for their family. He'd been there before, back when his mother still had money to buy medicine. He knew it closed early in the evenings, but he also knew something else. One of the windows in the back had a broken latch. The memory filled him with equal parts hope and dread. He'd never done anything like this before, never crossed the line between right and wrong. But tonight, the line seemed blurred, insignificant compared to the thought of losing Lily. Nathan pulled on his coat, the fabric thin and frayed at the edges. It offered little protection against the cold, but it was all he had. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, tucking it in tightly before slipping on his 2 small boots. As he opened the front door, the cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath for a moment. The wind whipped at his face, its icy fingers clawing at his skin. He stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath his feet, and pulled the door shut behind him. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound the howling wind and the faint creak of a weathered street sign swinging back and forth. The snow glistened under the streetlights, its surface untouched save for the occasional animal tracks that disappeared into the shadows. Nathan shivered as he began to walk, his steps quick and deliberate. The pharmacy wasn't far, but in the bitter cold, every step felt like a mile. He kept his head down, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, as he navigated the familiar streets. As he walked, Nathan's thoughts swirled like the snowflakes around him. He thought about Lily, about her laughter, and the way she always insisted on saving the best piece of food for him, even when she was hungry. He thought about his mother, about the woman she used to be before life had broken her spirit. Would she even care if she knew what I was doing? He wondered bitterly, before immediately feeling guilty for the thought. He tried to push those feelings aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. The pharmacy loomed ahead, its dark windows reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights. The building was small and unassuming, its white exterior now tinged gray from years of exposure to the elements. Nathan approached cautiously, his breath visible in the cold air. He walked around to the back, his boots crunching softly against the snow. The alley was narrow and dark, the shadows deepened by the faint light from a nearby street lamp. When he reached the window, Nathan hesitated. His hands trembled as he reached out to test the latch, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The window gave way easily, swinging open with a soft creak. For a moment, he froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around nervously, his eyes scanning the empty alley for any sign of movement. The world was silent, save for the wind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It's for Lily, he reminded himself, the thought steadying his resolve. He climbed through the window, landing softly on the floor inside. The pharmacy was dark, the faint smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. Shelves lined the walls, their contents barely visible in the dim light. Nathan moved quickly, his eyes scanning the labels for what he needed. He found the bottle of children's fever medicine on a lower shelf, its bright packaging standing out against the muted colors around it. He grabbed it and slipped it into his pocket, his fingers trembling as he did so. Climbing back out of the window, Nathan landed in the snow with a soft thud. He closed the window carefully behind him, his heart still racing as he turned to leave. The walk back felt longer than the journey there, every shadow and sound amplifying his sense of fear. But when he finally reached the house and stepped inside, the sight of Lily's small form on the bed filled him with a sense of purpose. He knelt beside her, carefully measuring out the medicine and holding the spoon to her lips. "Come on, Lily," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "Just a little bit." As she swallowed the first dose, Nathan felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. This extended chapter adds layers of vivid description and emotional depth, immersing readers in Nathan's journey and the critical decision he makes for Lily. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments. The next morning arrived with a gray and somber light, filtering through the frost-covered windows of Nathan's house. The snow outside had stopped falling, leaving behind a still, pristine landscape that seemed untouched by the chaos of the previous night. The wind had quieted to a soft murmur, its howls replaced by an eerie silence. Inside the small bedroom, the air was heavy with an uneasy calm. Lily lay still on the bed, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. The fever had started to break, her flushed cheeks now a pale pink. Her breathing, though still shallow, was no longer labored. Nathan sat beside her, his eyes fixed on her face as if willing her to wake up. His body ached from exhaustion, the events of the night before replaying in his mind like a broken record. He had done it. He had crossed the line he had always been taught never to cross. But as he watched Lily's small chest rise and fall, he knew he would do it all over again if it meant saving her. The fragile peace of the morning was shattered by a loud knock at the front door. The sound echoed through the quiet house, sharp and jarring. Nathan's heart skipped a beat, his mind immediately racing to the medicine bottle hidden under the bed. Another knock, louder this time. Nathan rose from his chair, his legs trembling as he walked to the door. Through the frosted glass, he could make out the shadowy figures of two men standing on the porch. "Police," one of them called out, his voice firm but not unkind. Nathan's stomach dropped. His hands shook as he unlocked the door and pulled it open, revealing two officers bundled in thick winter coats. Their badges glinted faintly in the pale morning light. "Are you Nathan?" the taller officer asked, his tone neutral. Nathan nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "We need to talk to you," the officer continued. "May we come in?" The officers stepped inside, their heavy boots leaving wet marks on the worn wooden floor. They looked around the small, dimly lit house, their eyes lingering on the sparse furniture and the thin blanket hanging over the window. The air inside was cold, the faint warmth of the stove barely enough to keep the chill at bay. Nathan stood frozen in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't tell if the officers were judging the state of the house or simply observing, but their presence felt overwhelming, as if they were intruding on a fragile world he had fought so hard to protect. "Where's your mother?" one of the officers asked, his voice softening slightly. Nathan hesitated. "She's upstairs," he said quietly. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before nodding. "We're here to talk about an incident at the pharmacy last night," he said, his gaze shifting back to Nathan. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. "We've got security footage from the pharmacy," the officer continued. "It shows someone entering through a back window and taking medicine." Nathan felt the blood drain from his face. He had known this moment would come, but the reality of it was more terrifying than he had imagined. I just... Nathan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer held up a hand to stop him. "We're not here to arrest you, Nathan. We just need to understand what happened." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint crackle of the stove. Nathan glanced toward the bedroom where Lily still lay, her small figure barely visible under the blanket. "I needed the medicine for my sister," he said finally, his voice trembling. "She was sick. I didn't know what else to do." The officers exchanged a look, their expressions softening slightly. The taller one sighed and knelt down to Nathan's level, meeting his wide, fearful eyes. "How old are you, son?" he asked gently. 10, Nathan replied, his voice barely audible. The officer nodded. "And you're the one taking care of your sister?" Nathan hesitated before nodding. "Our mom, she can't." He trailed off, unsure how to explain the truth without betraying his mother completely. The officers didn't press him further. Instead, the taller one stood and placed a reassuring hand on Nathan's shoulder. "We'll need to ask a few more questions, but for now, let's make sure your sister is okay." The officers followed Nathan to the bedroom, their presence feeling both invasive and necessary. Lily stirred slightly as they entered, her small body shifting under the blanket. "She's been sick for days," Nathan explained, his voice cracking. "I tried everything, but nothing worked. She was so hot, and I was scared." The shorter officer stepped forward, kneeling beside Lily's bed. He placed the back of his hand gently against her forehead and nodded. "Her fever's coming down," he said softly, "but she still needs proper care." Nathan watched as the officer straightened, his heart sinking at the weight of the statement. "I did everything I could," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. News of the incident spread quickly through the town. Whispers began to circulate, each version of the story more exaggerated than the last. Some painted Nathan as a desperate hero, while others condemned him as a delinquent. A neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, was the first to visit the house after hearing what had happened. She brought a small bag of groceries, her face lined with guilt as she handed it to Nathan. "I should have noticed something was wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Nathan." Nathan sat at the defendant's table, his small frame dwarfed by the chair designed for adults. He wore the only decent outfit he owned, a threadbare sweater and patched trousers that had been carefully cleaned the night before. His hands clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles white as he tried to steady his trembling fingers. Lily's laughter usually filled the void in his mind, but today it was the heavy silence of judgment that occupied every corner of his thoughts. His sister was at home, cared for by a kind neighbor who had stepped forward in the wake of the community's newfound awareness. Though he knew she was safe, the thought of being away from her gnawed at his resolve. The room was imposing. Large windows lined one wall, letting in shafts of cold winter light that reflected off the polished surfaces. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and the faint tang of ink from the legal papers scattered across the tables. At the front of the room, the judge's bench loomed high above, its dark wood worn smooth by years of deliberation. Judge Carter, a man with silver hair and a face weathered by decades of experience, presided over the proceedings. His piercing eyes scanned the room as he settled into his seat, his expression unreadable. He had seen countless cases in his time, but something about the young boy before him seemed different. To his right sat the prosecutor, a stern woman in a tailored suit. She adjusted her glasses as she shuffled through her papers, her sharp gaze occasionally landing on Nathan. To his left was Nathan's appointed lawyer, Mr. Rodriguez, a kind-faced man who had taken on the case with quiet determination. The townspeople filled the benches behind Nathan, their murmurs a low hum that echoed off the high ceilings. "Poor boy," someone whispered. "He's just a child." "But breaking into the pharmacy? That's not something we can just ignore," another voice countered. Nathan tried to block out their words, but they seeped into his consciousness, each comment a pinprick against his already fragile resolve. He stared at the table in front of him, his vision blurring slightly as tears threatened to spill. He wouldn't cry here, not in front of all these people. He had to be strong for Lily's sake. The gavel struck, its sharp crack silencing the room. Judge Carter leaned forward, his hands folded neatly on the bench. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "We are here to determine the circumstances surrounding the incident at Carlton's pharmacy and the actions of the defendant, Nathan Turner." Nathan felt the weight of every eye in the room turned to him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum. The prosecutor stood first, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached the jury box. She began her opening statement, painting a picture of the crime: the broken window, the stolen medicine, and the breach of trust in the community. "This is not just about theft," she said, her voice firm. "It's about the safety and integrity of our town. We cannot condone such actions, even from a child." Nathan's hands tightened on the edge of the table. He wanted to shout, to explain that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that he'd only been trying to save his sister. But he stayed silent, his lawyer's earlier advice echoing in his mind. "Let me do the talking." When it was Mr. Rodriguez's turn, he rose from his seat with calm confidence. He spoke directly to the jury, his voice steady and compassionate. "Yes, Nathan took the medicine," he admitted. "But this is not a case of malice or greed. It is a case of desperation. A young boy left to care for his sick sister in the absence of any adult support did what he thought was necessary to save her life." He gestured toward Nathan, who sat hunched over, his head bowed. "This is not a criminal. This is a child who has been failed by the very systems meant to protect him." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over the crowd. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily at a loss for how to respond. The first witness was the pharmacy owner, Mr. Carlton. He described finding the broken window and the missing medicine, his tone clipped and angry. But under cross-examination, he admitted that nothing else had been stolen, and the medicine taken was of no significant monetary value. Next came the security footage. The grainy video showed Nathan climbing through the window, his small frame moving quickly and deliberately. The sight of himself on the screen made Nathan's stomach churn, the reality of his actions hitting him with full force. Then came the character witnesses. Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who had brought groceries, described Nathan's tireless efforts to care for Lily. "He's just a boy," she said, her voice trembling, "and he's been doing the work of an adult, all on his own." Others came forward with similar stories, painting a picture of a child thrust into an impossible situation. Finally, it was Nathan's turn. He stood slowly, his legs shaking as he made his way to the stand. He avoided meeting anyone's eyes, focusing instead on the polished wood of the podium. "Nathan," Mr. Rodriguez began gently, "can you tell us why you went to the pharmacy that night?" Nathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Lily, my sister," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was sick, really sick. I didn't know what else to do." Tears welled in his eyes as he continued. "I tried to wake my mom, but she wouldn't get up. I tried everything I could think of, but nothing worked. I was scared. I thought she might die." The room was silent, every person hanging on his every word. Even the prosecutor seemed moved, her stern expression softening slightly. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Nathan said, his voice breaking. I just wanted to help her." When Nathan finished, Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping across the room before finally settling on Nathan. "You are a remarkable young man, Nathan," he said, his voice steady. "But what you did was dangerous, and it could have ended very differently." Nathan's heart sank, fear gripping him as he waited for the judge's next words. "However," Judge Carter continued, "this court recognizes that your actions were born out of desperation and love for your sister. Rather than punishment, what you and your family need is support." The judge turned to the crowd. "This community has failed this boy. It is our responsibility to ensure that no child is ever put in this position again." The trial ended with a collective sigh of relief. Nathan was placed under the care of a social worker, who worked to ensure that he and Lily would have the resources they needed. The community, inspired by Nathan's bravery, began organizing efforts to support struggling families. As Nathan left the courtroom, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long time, he believed that things might finally get better. The days after the trial were a blur of emotions for Nathan. The weight of uncertainty that had pressed on his shoulders for so long began to lift, but in its place came a strange, unfamiliar sensation: hope. For the first time in months, he wasn't entirely alone. The community, which had once turned a blind eye to his struggles, was now stepping forward to help. The morning after the trial, Nathan woke to the sound of voices outside his house. The light filtering through the window was soft, casting a pale golden hue across the worn wooden floor. He rose quietly, careful not to wake Lily, and peeked through the thin curtain. A group of neighbors stood outside, bundled in coats and scarves against the cold. They carried bags of groceries, firewood, and blankets. Mrs. Peterson, the kind woman who had testified on his behalf, was organizing the small group, her voice gentle but firm as she directed them. Nathan's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had spent so long feeling invisible, forgotten. To see these people now standing in the cold for him and Lily was almost overwhelming. The house, once so cold and lifeless, began to change. The kitchen table, once bare, now held a modest spread of food: fresh bread, canned goods, and even a carton of milk. The wood-burning stove, which had been reduced to embers most nights, now crackled warmly, filling the small space with a comforting heat. Nathan stood in the kitchen, his hands hovering over the stove as he let the warmth seep into his fingers. He glanced toward the bedroom, where Lily was still asleep, her small body buried under a pile of donated blankets. Her cheeks had regained a healthy flush, and her breathing was steady and calm. It felt surreal. For months, he had lived in survival mode, rationing every crumb of food, every ounce of energy. Now, for the first time, he could breathe. Later that day, the door creaked open to reveal Judge Carter standing on the porch. His tall frame seemed even more imposing in the soft winter light, but his expression was warm. Beside him was the social worker, Miss Thompson, who had been assigned to help Nathan and Lily. Nathan's stomach twisted with nerves as he stepped aside to let them in. The house, though warmer and better stocked than it had been in months, still bore the marks of poverty. The peeling paint, the creaking floorboards, and the mismatched furniture all spoke of a life lived on the edge. Judge Carter took a seat at the kitchen table, his presence filling the small room. "How are you holding up, Nathan?" he asked, his tone gentle. Nathan hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Better," he said finally. "Lily's doing better, too." Miss Thompson smiled. "That's good to hear. We're here to talk about some long-term plans for you and your sister." The conversation that followed was both hopeful and daunting. Miss Thompson explained that they would be receiving regular support from the community and local charities. She talked about getting Nathan back into school and finding resources to help their mother recover. Nathan listened carefully, his mind racing. The idea of going back to school felt strange, almost foreign. He hadn't set foot in a classroom in over a year, and the thought of leaving Lily even for a few hours made his chest tighten. "What about Lily?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Who will take care of her if I'm at school?" Miss Thompson reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on his. "We're working on a plan for that," she said. "You've been amazing, Nathan, but you don't have to do this alone anymore." In the weeks that followed, the town began to change. Inspired by Nathan's story, the community came together in ways it never had before. A group of volunteers started a food pantry, ensuring that no child would go hungry. The local church opened its doors as a shelter for families in need, and a group of teachers offered free tutoring sessions for children who had fallen behind in school. Nathan watched these changes with a mix of awe and disbelief. He had spent so long feeling like the world was against him, and now it felt like it was finally working in his favor. One afternoon, as he walked home from the market with a bag of fresh produce, a gift from Mrs. Peterson, he passed the pharmacy. The broken window had been replaced, its glass gleaming in the sunlight. Nathan paused, his reflection staring back at him. He thought about that night, about the fear and desperation that had driven him to climb through that window. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet the memory was still vivid. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he could use it to move forward. Lily's health continued to improve, her laughter once again filling the small house. Nathan took joy in watching her play with the other children in the neighborhood, her energy and curiosity returning with each passing day. One evening, as they sat together by the stove, Lily curled up beside him with a book in her lap. "Nathan," she said, her voice soft, "are things going to be okay now?" Nathan looked down at her, his heart swelling with love and determination. "Yeah, Lily," he said, his voice steady. "Things are going to be okay." Despite the newfound support, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do more. He had spent so long being the one who needed help that the idea of simply accepting it felt foreign. Spring arrived in the small town with a quiet sense of renewal. The snow that had once blanketed the streets melted away, revealing patches of green grass and budding wildflowers. The air, still crisp from the remnants of winter, carried the faint scent of blooming trees and fresh earth. The town was no longer the cold, indifferent place it had been. Something had shifted, not just in the weather, but in the hearts of the people who lived there. Nathan stood on the front porch of their now-repaired home, the sun warming his face as he watched Lily chase a butterfly in the small patch of garden that Mrs. Peterson had helped them plant. Her laughter rang out, pure and unburdened, a stark contrast to the weary silence that had once filled their days. Nathan couldn't help but smile. For months, he had fought to protect Lily, to keep her safe in a world that had seemed so cruel and uncaring. Now, watching her run barefoot through the grass, her cheeks rosy with health, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Peace. The house, once a symbol of neglect and hardship, had transformed into a home. The walls had been repainted a soft cream color, their peeling surfaces smoothed over by volunteers from the community. The windows, once fogged with frost and grime, now sparkled in the sunlight, letting in streams of warmth and light. The kitchen, always the heart of the home, was now a bustling space filled with life. The shelves were stocked with canned goods and fresh produce, and the stove burned steadily, its warmth spilling into every corner. A new table, donated by a local carpenter, stood proudly in the center of the room, its polished surface reflecting the bright, cheerful space around it. Nathan had taken to cooking with Lily by his side, her small hands eagerly helping to stir pots or knead dough. It was a far cry from the nights he had spent scavenging scraps to keep her fed. Now, every meal was a reminder of how far they had come. The town itself had changed, as if Nathan's story had thawed the icy barrier that had once divided its people. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged each other now stopped to chat on the street, their conversations punctuated by warm laughter. The food pantry, started in the wake of Nathan's trial, had become a cornerstone of the community, providing for families in need and reminding everyone of the power of shared kindness. And so, as Nathan's story comes to an end, a new one begins, not just for him, but for everyone in his town. His journey reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found in the kindness of others. What about you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment of unexpected kindness? What can you do today to bring hope to someone who needs it? Share your story, because in sharing, we remind each other that we're never truly alone. Thank you so much for watching this story. If it touched your heart or inspired you in any way, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update from us. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content, and together we can spread positivity and inspiration to even more people. Let's build a community where kindness and compassion are celebrated. Join us and let's make the world a better place, one story at a time.